The summons arrived without warning, a narrow beam of blue light projecting itself across the cockpit of Ryan Nash's shuttle just as he was finishing a routine cargo inspection. At first he thought it was another navigation update, or perhaps one of the endless procedural notices that seemed to breed in the systems overnight. But when he tapped the console, the display reorganized itself into a seal he had only seen once before in a briefing room, the crest of the Thess'ara Royal Authority. Ryan stared at it for several seconds, waiting for the inevitable correction that would reveal it was meant for someone else. None came. The message contained no explanation, no greeting, and no signature beyond the crest itself. It listed coordinates, a departure clearance that overrode every shipping lane restriction in 3 sectors, and a single line of text. Pilot Ryan Nash is requested to present himself at the Royal Palace of Thesara without delay. He leaned back slowly in his chair and looked around the empty cockpit, as if expecting someone to step out from behind a console and laugh at the joke. Nothing happened. The only sound was the steady hum of the life support systems and the faint crackle of distant solar interference against the hull. "Well," he said aloud to no one, "that's either very good news or very bad news." The autopilot chimed, indifferent to his uncertainty. 2 hours later, his shuttle was descending through the upper atmosphere of Thesara, gliding through clouds tinted faintly violet by minerals suspended in the air. The planet always surprised visitors. From orbit, it appeared pale and almost lifeless, but within the atmosphere, the light refracted in ways that turned even the simplest landscape into something luminous and strange. Ryan had been here once before, briefly during an emergency evacuation of a research convoy months earlier. He remembered smoke, alarms, and a docking bay filled with injured personnel. He did not remember faces. He rarely did after operations like that. Survival tended to blur details into motion and urgency. As the shuttle approached the capital, the palace came into view, rising from the terrain like a sculpture grown from crystal and bone. Its towers curved rather than stood straight, and translucent bridges stretched between them like strands of frozen light. Even from the air, Ryan could see figures moving along those bridges, their elongated silhouettes unmistakably Thessaran. He exhaled slowly. Whatever this was about, it was serious enough to bring him here. The landing platform received his shuttle with silent precision. The moment the hatch opened, a pair of royal guards stood waiting. They were tall, their long ears swept back slightly, their uniforms layered with pale metallic fabric that shifted color with every movement. "Pilot Ryan Nash," one of them said in clear, careful standard. "That's me," Ryan replied. "I hope." The guard inclined his head as if acknowledging the attempt at humor, but not quite understanding it. "You are expected. Please follow us." They walked through corridors that seemed carved rather than constructed, the walls faintly warm to the touch, as if the palace itself possessed some slow, living circulation of heat. Soft light glowed from within the material rather than from visible fixtures, giving the impression that the entire structure was breathing. Ryan tried not to stare, but it was difficult. He had visited many worlds, many stations, many outposts where metal and circuitry dominated every surface. This place felt organic, not fragile, but alive in a way that made him feel oddly like an intruder inside a giant sleeping creature. After several minutes, one of the guards spoke again. "Few humans are summoned here." "That's comforting," Ryan said. "I always enjoy being rare." The second guard's lips twitched very slightly, which Ryan decided to interpret as a success. They stopped before a set of immense doors, their surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them directly. The guard stepped aside and the doors opened without a sound. The receiving chamber was vast, its ceiling arching high above in a translucent dome through which the pale sky of Thesara could be seen. The air carried a faint, sweet scent he could not identify, like flowers mixed with clean rain. At the far end of the chamber stood 2 figures. One was unmistakably the Queen Regent, her posture composed, her presence commanding without effort. Beside her stood a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s by human standards, though Ryan knew Thessaran lifespans made such comparisons unreliable. Her long ears curved gracefully behind her head, and her expression before she noticed him was calm and attentive. Ryan took a few steps forward, Suddenly aware of the sound of his own boots echoing across the polished floor, he felt absurdly underdressed, absurdly out of place, and profoundly uncertain why he was here at all. Then the young woman looked at him. Her composure shattered instantly. Her eyes widened, and she inhaled sharply, as if the air itself had surprised her. For a moment she simply stared, frozen, and then she turned toward the Queen Regent, her voice breaking with sudden urgency. "Mother, the person I want to marry has arrived." Ryan stopped walking. The words hung in the air with a clarity that made it impossible to pretend he had misheard. Every sound in the chamber seemed to vanish, leaving only the faint echo of her voice. He blinked once, then twice, waiting for someone to laugh, to explain, to correct the misunderstanding that must surely have occurred. No one did. The Queen Regent regarded him with an expression that was neither shocked nor amused, but deeply thoughtful, as if she were observing a rare astronomical event whose significance had yet to be fully calculated. Ryan became aware that his mouth was slightly open and closed it quickly. He began, then stopped, because he had absolutely no idea what to say next. After a moment he managed, "I think there may be some confusion." The young woman looked at him again, and to his surprise a faint flush of embarrassment crossed her face. Yet beneath it there was also certainty, calm, unwavering certainty, like someone who had recognized a familiar constellation in the night sky. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly wishing he were back in his shuttle, dealing with malfunctioning thrusters or radiation storms. Anything simpler than this. Because whatever was happening here, he had the unsettling feeling that his life had just changed in a way no flight manual had ever prepared him for. The silence that followed her words stretched so long that Ryan began to notice small details he would normally have ignored. The faint vibration of the chamber floor beneath his boots, the slow ripple of light across the curved walls, the distant, almost musical hum of atmospheric regulators hidden somewhere high in the dome. It was remarkable how many things one could hear when an entire room of people stopped breathing at once. Ryan cleared his throat softly, hoping that would somehow restart time. It didn't. The young woman seemed to realize what she had said only after the words had fully settled into the air. A faint flush crept across her cheeks, and she lowered her gaze for a moment, pressing her lips together as if trying to gather her composure. Yet when she looked up again, the embarrassment remained, but it was accompanied by something steadier, an unmistakable certainty. The Queen Regent finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, carrying easily across the chamber. "Lady Kayla'ryn," she said gently, "perhaps you would like to explain." Kayla'ryn exhaled slowly, then stepped forward. Her movements were graceful, but Ryan noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, as though she were bracing herself for something difficult. "You do not remember me," she said to Ryan. Ryan hesitated. "I meet a lot of people," he admitted, "usually under less formal circumstances." A faint, unexpected smile touched her lips. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly the problem." She turned slightly, gesturing toward a tall, translucent panel set into the wall. At her signal, the surface shimmered and resolved into an image, a recording. Ryan saw a docking bay filled with smoke and flashing emergency lights. Figures moved through the haze, carrying the injured, shouting over the alarms. And there, in the center of the recording, was himself, dragging a limp figure toward a shuttle ramp, while arguing loudly with someone off-screen about the proper way to override a damaged airlock. Ryan winced slightly. "I remember the airlock," he said. "It kept insisting on locking itself at the worst possible moment." Kayla'ryn tilted her head. "You were arguing with a computer." "It started it," Ryan said automatically, then stopped, realizing what he had just said and sighed. "All right, that sounds worse out loud." To his surprise, a few of the attendants near the walls exchanged amused glances, and Kayla'ryn's smile grew a little brighter. She gestured again, and the recording focused on the person Ryan had been carrying. The face was partially obscured by soot and a medical mask, but the long ears were unmistakable. Ryan stared at the image, then slowly looked back at her. "That was you." "Yes," Kayla'ryn said quietly. "You carried me through a burning corridor and onto your shuttle. You stayed until the last transport launched, even after the structural alarms had begun." Ryan shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable. That was my job. No, she said, her voice gentle but firm. It was not your job to stay after your assigned evacuation group had departed. You chose to remain. Ryan opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He remembered the moment now. The hesitation before sealing the hatch. The sound of distant voices still trapped in the station. The simple, stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind if he could help it. He rubbed the back of his neck again. Well, it seemed like the right thing to do. Kayla'ryn studied him for a moment, and there was something in her gaze that made Ryan feel oddly transparent, as though she were seeing not just his words but the quiet, unspoken reasons behind them. For my people, she said softly, a life freely saved creates a bond that cannot be ignored. It is not ownership nor obligation, but recognition. A life becomes tied to another, and the heart understands this even when the mind does not. Ryan let out a slow breath. That's a lot to put on someone who was mostly trying not to trip over debris. This time, even the Queen Regent's expression softened slightly, and Kayla'ryn laughed, a light, musical sound that seemed to ease the tension in the chamber. I did not mean, she said, still smiling faintly, that you were required to feel as I do, only that I could not pretend otherwise. Ryan considered this. The situation was still surreal, still deeply confusing, but there was an honesty in her words that made it difficult to dismiss them outright. So, he said carefully, you're saying that, from your perspective, we're connected. Yes. And from my perspective, he said, I just walked into a room and got proposed to before anyone offered me a chair. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the attendants, and even Kayla'ryn pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with amusement. I did forget the chair, she admitted. That was very poor protocol. Well, Ryan said, glancing around the vast chamber, I suppose I can forgive that, given the circumstances. The Queen Regent stepped forward then, her presence drawing the room back into stillness. Pilot Nash, she said, you must understand that my daughter's words were not spoken lightly, yet neither are you bound by them. You are a guest here, and you will be treated as such while we decide how best to proceed. Ryan inclined his head, relieved by the calm authority in her tone. I appreciate that, Your Majesty, though I admit this is not the strangest thing that's ever happened to me, just the strangest thing that's happened indoors. Kayla'ryn glanced at him curiously. What was the strangest thing? Ryan thought for a moment. A cargo crate once started singing. She blinked. Singing? Yes, it turned out to contain a colony of harmonic spores that reacted to engine vibrations. Very beautiful, extremely inconvenient. Kayla'ryn laughed again, and this time the sound echoed lightly through the chamber, dissolving the last traces of stiffness in the air. As Ryan stood there, listening to that laughter, he realized that his confusion had not disappeared, but it had begun, quietly, to transform into something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or the faint, unexpected sense that the path ahead, however strange, might be worth following. Ryan did not leave the palace that day, or the next. The Queen Regent insisted that, as a guest, he should be given time to rest and to become acquainted with Thess'ara before any decisions were made. Ryan suspected this was a polite way of saying that no one, including the Queen herself, quite knew what to do with a human pilot who had accidentally become the center of a royal courtship. His assigned quarters overlooked a wide expanse of pale gardens that glowed faintly at night, the plants emitting a soft, bioluminescent shimmer. The first evening, Ryan spent nearly an hour watching a cluster of floating seed lights drift lazily above the ground like miniature stars. When one of the palace attendants informed him that the seeds were technically semi-sentient and preferred not to be stared at too intensely, Ryan decided it was safest to close the balcony doors. The following morning, Kayla'ryn came to escort him on what she called a simple walk. Ryan quickly learned that on Thes'ara, a simple walk involved 3 transport platforms, 2 ceremonial corridors, and at least one brief lecture on the cultural significance of architectural symmetry. I'm beginning to understand, Ryan said as they stepped onto a moving pathway that carried them through an open-air gallery, why your people invented floating walkways. Kayla'ryn tilted her head. To reduce fatigue? To reduce speeches about corridors, Ryan replied. She laughed, and the sound echoed lightly along the curved walls. They emerged into a vast garden where slender, crystalline structures rose among flowering terraces. Tiny hovering drones moved silently through the air, adjusting the angle of reflective panels that directed sunlight onto specific plants. Ryan watched one of the drones drift past, its surface shifting colors in response to the light. I take it gardening here requires an engineering degree. Two, in some cases, Kayla'ryn said. The eastern terraces are maintained by botanists who specialize in stellar radiation adaptation. I once killed a cactus, Ryan admitted. Kayla'ryn stopped walking. A cactus? Yes, I was told it required almost no care. I somehow proved that statement incorrect. She studied him for a moment, then said solemnly, That is impressive. They continued walking, and as they did, the conversation drifted more easily than Ryan had expected. Kayla'ryn spoke about her studies in orbital mechanics, about the observatories that monitored distant pulsars, about the way her people charted not only stars but gravitational harmonics, patterns in space-time that shifted like tides. Ryan listened, fascinated despite himself. He had spent most of his life flying through space, but he had rarely thought about it the way she described it. Not as empty distance, but as a living structure of currents and subtle movements. At one point, they passed a small pavilion where a group of children were gathered around a holographic projection of a star system. The children were arguing energetically about the most efficient way to redirect an asteroid using synchronized ion bursts. Ryan leaned toward Kayla'ryn. I'm fairly sure that when I was their age, I was arguing about whose turn it was to clean the kitchen. One of those debates sounds far more dangerous, she said. I agree. Kitchens are terrifying places. They walked on, and gradually the gardens gave way to a high terrace overlooking the city. From there, Ryan could see the distant shimmer of atmospheric ships gliding between towers, their engines silent at this distance, leaving faint trails of refracted light. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Kayla'ryn said quietly, I know this is strange for you. Ryan considered the city below, then nodded. It is, but not in a bad way. Just unexpected. She rested her hands lightly on the railing, her gaze distant. When I was young, I used to imagine what it would be like to leave Thes'ara, to see other worlds. I thought the universe must feel very large and very lonely. And does it? Ryan asked. She looked at him. Not as much as I expected. Ryan felt an odd, quiet warmth at her words, though he wasn't entirely sure why. A faint chime sounded from a device at her wrist. She glanced at it and sighed softly. I am required to attend a council briefing in an hour. I had hoped to show you the observatory before then. I'll still be here, Ryan said. I'm not exactly cleared to fly off in the royal shuttle. That is probably wise, she said, smiling. As they turned to leave the terrace, a small maintenance drone zipped past at high speed, narrowly missing Ryan's shoulder. He flinched instinctively. Sorry, the drone said in a perfectly polite, synthesized voice as it disappeared down the corridor. Ryan blinked. Did that drone just apologize to me? Yes, Kayla'ryn said. They are programmed for courtesy. I feel judged, Ryan said. I've met humans with worse manners. Kayla'ryn laughed again, and as they walked back through the sunlit corridors, Ryan realized that the palace no longer felt quite as alien as it had the day before. The walls still glowed, the air still carried unfamiliar scents, and the customs still puzzled him, but the strangeness was no longer isolating. It was, in a way he hadn't expected, becoming familiar. The summons from the Queen Regent came in the late afternoon, delivered by a quiet attendant who appeared at Ryan's quarters with the kind of calm expression that suggested nothing urgent was happening, which Ryan had begun to suspect usually meant something very important was about to happen. He followed the attendant through a different section of the palace than he had seen before. The corridors here were narrower, the walls darker, not dim but deeper in tone, as if the light itself had been softened to encourage thought rather than spectacle. Through tall, curved windows, he could see the upper atmosphere of Thes'ara, shifting in long streaks of pale gold. Evening approaching. They stopped before a set of doors far simpler than the grand entrances Ryan had grown accustomed to. When they opened, he found himself in a chamber that felt almost intimate compared to the vast receiving hall. Shelves of crystalline data tablets lined the walls, and in the center stood a low table surrounded by curved seats. The Queen Regent was alone. "Pilot Nash," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for coming." Ryan sat carefully, feeling suddenly aware of the faint scuff on one of his boots, and wondering if royal floors notice such things. "It's hard to refuse a royal invitation," he said. "I've learned that much." A hint of amusement flickered in her eyes. "You have adjusted quickly." "I've had practice adjusting to strange situations," Ryan replied, "though I admit most of them did not involve bioluminescent gardens and philosophical drones." The Queen Regent folded her hands, studying him with the same steady attention he remembered from the receiving chamber. It was not an uncomfortable gaze, but it was thorough, like a scientist examining an unfamiliar but interesting specimen. "My daughter speaks highly of you," she said. Ryan shifted slightly. "Your daughter is very kind." "She is also perceptive," the Queen replied, "and she does not form attachments lightly." Ryan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't doubt her sincerity," he said finally. "I only question whether I deserve the certainty she feels." The Queen Regent regarded him for a long moment, then said quietly, "That is precisely why I wish to speak with you." She rose and walked to one of the windows, looking out at the fading light. "Our people believe that bonds formed in crisis reveal truths that ordinary life conceals. But belief does not remove responsibility. A bond is not a command. It must be understood, not merely accepted." Ryan listened, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "When Kayla'ryn was younger," the Queen continued, "she once attempted to repair a damaged navigation drone herself. She was certain she understood the design. She was also completely wrong. The resulting explosion destroyed 3 instruments and filled an entire wing of the palace with adhesive foam." Ryan blinked. "Adhesive foam?" "It required 6 hours to remove," the Queen said, "and she spent those 6 hours apologizing to every servant she encountered." Ryan couldn't help it. He laughed. "I like her already." "So do I," the Queen said softly. She turned back to him. "I do not ask whether you will marry my daughter. That is not a decision to be made quickly, nor one to be made under pressure. I ask only this. Are you willing to know her, truly know her, as a person, not as a symbol of a bond or a duty?" Ryan considered the question carefully. It was not as simple as it sounded. Knowing someone required time, patience, and the willingness to see both strengths and flaws. "Yes," he said at last. "I am." The Queen inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging an answer she had hoped to hear. At that moment, a soft chime sounded from a console near the wall. The Queen glanced at it, then sighed faintly. "It seems the orbital monitoring station has detected a fluctuation in the outer defense grid. Minor, but persistent." Ryan leaned forward instinctively. "May I see it?" She studied him for a moment, then activated the display. A 3-dimensional projection of the planet appeared above the table, surrounded by a lattice of faintly glowing lines representing the defense network. One segment flickered intermittently. Ryan stood, moving closer to the projection. "That's a synchronization drift," he said after a moment. "The satellites are compensating for a timing error, but they're not communicating the correction efficiently." The Queen raised an eyebrow. "You can tell that from this?" "I've seen something similar in convoy shield arrays," Ryan said. "If you recalibrate the relay sequence, here and here, the drift should stabilize." One of the attendants monitoring the system made the adjustment. The flicker disappeared. The Queen regarded Ryan with new interest. "It seems you are useful in more ways than one." "I try to be," Ryan said. "It keeps life interesting." As the projection faded, the tension in the room eased slightly. The Queen returned to her seat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, "You are not what I expected, Pilot Nash." Ryan smiled faintly. "That makes 2 of us, Your Majesty." When he left the chamber a short time later, the corridors felt quieter than usual, the palace settling into the calm of evening. As he walked, he realized that his nervousness had changed again. It was no longer the sharp unease of uncertainty, but something steadier, a sense that he was beginning, slowly, to find his place in this strange and luminous world. And for the first time since receiving the summons, the future no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a question. The alert reached the palace shortly after midnight, when most of the towers had dimmed to their night glow, and the gardens shone softly beneath the pale sky. Ryan was awake, sitting near the balcony of his quarters, watching the drifting seed lights again, and trying to decide whether they really were observing him in return. He had just concluded that he was probably imagining it when a clear, melodic tone sounded from the wall console. "Pilot Nash," said a calm voice, "you are requested in the orbital coordination chamber." Ryan blinked. "Of course I am," he muttered, pulling on his jacket. Nothing good ever starts with those words. The coordination chamber was alive with activity when he arrived. Holographic displays hovered in layered arcs across the room, showing orbital trajectories, energy readings, and long ribbons of shifting data. Thess'aran technicians moved swiftly between consoles, their movements precise but unhurried, like dancers who already knew every step. Kayla'ryn stood near the central projection, speaking with a cluster of analysts. When she saw Ryan, relief flickered across her face. "I am glad you came," she said. "I was told I was requested," Ryan replied. "I've learned that means I shouldn't ask too many questions until after I arrive." A faint smile touched her lips. "A disturbance has been detected in the outer shield array. Not a failure, but something unusual." The central display expanded, revealing a band of orbiting satellites forming a luminous defensive lattice around the planet. One section pulsed irregularly, its rhythm slightly out of phase with the rest. Ryan studied it, frowning. "That's not random," he said. "It's oscillating in a pattern." "Yes," Kayla'ryn said quietly, "but we do not yet understand why." An analyst adjusted the projection, isolating the affected satellites. Lines of simulated trajectories appeared, showing tiny but persistent deviations. Ryan stepped closer, his pilot's instincts taking over. "It's like a resonance," he said. "Something's nudging them. Not physically, but gravitationally. Very subtly." Kayla'ryn looked at him. "A natural phenomenon?" "Maybe," Ryan said. "Or maybe something passing through the outer system. A dense object, small but fast." One of the technicians spoke from across the chamber. "We are detecting a micro-singularity wake at extreme range." Ryan raised his eyebrows. "Well," he said, "that would do it." Kayla'ryn tilted her head. "You sound almost pleased." "I've never seen one up close," Ryan admitted. "Professionally speaking, it's fascinating. Personally speaking, I would prefer it remain very far away." The tension in the room eased slightly at that, and a few of the technicians allowed themselves quiet smiles. For the next hour, Ryan worked alongside them, helping interpret the data and suggesting adjustments to the satellite timing sequences. Kayla'ryn moved easily through the room, coordinating teams, translating technical terms between different systems of notation, and occasionally pausing to ask Ryan for his perspective. At one point, a small maintenance drone drifted past carrying a tray of steaming cups. It hovered uncertainly near Ryan. "Pilot Nash," it said politely, "would you like a beverage calibrated for human metabolism?" Ryan accepted a cup, sniffed it cautiously, and took a sip. "That's surprisingly good. It is formulated to resemble a beverage known as coffee," the drone said. Ryan stared at it. "Resemble?" "Yes. The original substance was determined to be chemically aggressive." Ryan laughed softly. "That's a very diplomatic way of putting it." The hours passed quickly, the work absorbing enough that Ryan barely noticed the slow brightening of the sky beyond the chamber windows. At last, the irregular oscillation in the shield lattice stabilized, the satellites settling back into perfect synchronization as the distant disturbance moved beyond effective range. A quiet sense of relief spread through the room. Kayla'ryn exhaled slowly. "It appears the danger has passed." Ryan nodded, leaning back against the console. "You handled that well." "We handled it," she corrected gently. They stepped away from the displays, moving toward a quieter corner of the chamber, where the glow of the projections was softer. "I have seen you in flight," she said after a moment, "in the recordings from the evacuation. But tonight, I saw how you think." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, a familiar gesture. "I mostly think about not crashing into things." "That is a useful skill," she said solemnly. He chuckled. "You'd be surprised how often." For a while they stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the technicians powering down auxiliary systems. The chamber felt different now, calmer, the tension replaced by quiet satisfaction. "I was afraid," Kayla'ryn said softly, "that you might feel trapped here, that you would see this world only as a place that had claimed you." Ryan considered her words carefully. "I did feel that way, at first," he admitted, "but not tonight." She looked at him, her expression searching. "Tonight," he said, "I felt like I was part of something. Not an outsider, just another person trying to keep a planet safe." Kayla'ryn smiled, and there was warmth in that smile that lingered long after the words faded. As they left the chamber together, the first light of dawn spread across the sky of Thessara, turning the distant clouds into waves of pale gold. Ryan paused for a moment at the window, watching the light grow. He realized then that the palace no longer felt like a place he had been summoned to. It felt, in some quiet and unexpected way, like a place he was beginning to belong. The summons came again, but this time Ryan was not surprised when the message appeared on his console. He had begun to recognize the quiet rhythm of the palace, the way important conversations were rarely rushed and never announced with unnecessary urgency. Still, there was something different in the wording. "The Queen Regent requests your presence. Lady Kayla'ryn will attend." Ryan stood for a moment, staring at the message, then exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured, "this is probably important." The chamber they were led to was not the receiving hall, nor the study where Ryan had spoken privately with the Queen before. This room was circular, its walls formed from smooth, pale stone that seemed to absorb sound, leaving the air calm and still. A wide window opened onto the horizon, where the sky of Thessara glowed in layered shades of silver and blue. Kayla'ryn was already there when Ryan entered. She turned toward him, and he noticed at once that she looked nervous, though she tried to hide it behind a composed expression. "That's not a reassuring look," Ryan said quietly as he approached. "Should I be worried?" "I am not certain," she admitted, "but I suspect this conversation will be important." The doors opened behind them, and the Queen Regent entered alone. She regarded them both for a moment, as if measuring not only their expressions but the quiet distance between them. "Please," she said, gesturing toward the low seats arranged near the window. "Sit." They did, the silence settling around them like a still surface of water. "I have watched the two of you these past days," the Queen began, "not as a ruler, but as a mother. I have seen how you speak to one another when you believe no one is listening. I have seen how you work together, how you laugh together, and how you hesitate when the conversation turns to the future." Ryan felt a faint, uncomfortable warmth rise in his chest. It was strange to realize how visible even the smallest moments must be in a place like this. "My daughter believes in the bond between you," the Queen continued, "but belief alone does not create a life. Understanding does." Kayla'ryn lowered her gaze slightly. "I know, Mother." The Queen looked at Ryan. "And you, Pilot Nash, what do you understand?" Ryan hesitated. There were many things he did not understand. Thessaran traditions, the quiet depth of their emotional customs, the strange and luminous beauty of this world. But there were also things that had become clear to him in ways he had not expected. "I understand," he said slowly, "that I care about her. Not because of a bond or a debt, because of who she is." Kayla'ryn looked up at him, surprise and something softer flickering in her eyes. Ryan continued, choosing his words carefully. "But I also understand that caring about someone isn't the same as knowing what the future should be. I've spent most of my life moving from one system to another. I'm good at leaving. I'm less experienced at staying." A faint smile touched the Queen's lips. "An honest answer." Kayla'ryn clasped her hands together, her voice quiet but steady. "I once believed the bond was enough, that it meant the path was already chosen. But I do not believe that anymore. I want, whatever we become, to be something we choose, not something we inherit." Ryan looked at her, and in that moment he saw not the princess who had startled an entire court with her declaration, but a young woman who was trying, with quiet courage, to be fair, to him and to herself. The Queen Regent rose and walked to the window, looking out at the distant horizon. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke. Then that is my answer. Ryan blinked. Your Majesty? You will not be asked to decide anything now, she said. You will remain here as long as you wish, and you will leave when you wish. If in time you and my daughter choose a path together, it will be because it is truly yours. Kayla'ryn exhaled softly, as if she had been holding her breath for days. Ryan felt a similar sense of quiet relief, like a pressure he hadn't fully noticed lifting from his shoulders. Thank you, he said simply. The Queen turned back to them, and for the first time Ryan saw not the ruler of a world, but a mother whose expression carried both pride and tenderness. There is one more matter, she said. Ryan braced himself instinctively. That never sounds minor. Kayla'ryn gave him a quick, amused glance. The Queen's eyes glinted faintly. The palace kitchens have filed a formal complaint. Ryan stared at her. I'm afraid to ask. They report that you described a traditional Thess'ara nutrient spiral as an aggressively enthusiastic vegetable. Kayla'ryn covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with laughter. Ryan raised his hands defensively. In my defense, it moved first. It is not supposed to move, the Queen said calmly. That's what worried me. For a moment, the chamber filled with quiet laughter, the tension dissolving completely. Later, as Ryan and Kayla'ryn walked together through the evening gardens, the air cool and filled with the faint glow of luminous blossoms. Neither of them spoke for a while. At last, Kayla'ryn said softly, I am glad she said that. So am I, Ryan replied. It's easier to think about tomorrow when no one is trying to decide it for you. They reached a terrace overlooking the distant lights of the city. Ships moved silently across the sky, their engines leaving faint shimmering trails. Ryan leaned against the railing, watching them. You know, he said after a moment, a few weeks ago, I thought the most complicated decision I'd have to make this year was whether to replace my shuttle's guidance system. And now? Kayla'ryn asked. Now, he said, glancing at her with a faint smile, I'm trying to understand an entire world. She smiled back, and in the quiet of the glowing garden, the future no longer felt like something distant or uncertain. It felt close enough to reach, even if neither of them yet knew exactly what shape it would take. The morning Ryan realized he no longer felt like a visitor arrived quietly, without ceremony or sudden revelation. He was standing in one of the upper docking galleries watching a line of atmospheric ships drift into the pale sky, when it occurred to him that he recognized the flight patterns without thinking about them. He knew which routes connected to the orbital platforms, which vessels carried scientific crews, and which were supply transports bound for the outer stations. A few weeks earlier, all of it would have been unfamiliar. Now it felt readable, like a language he had begun to understand. Pilot Nash, said a voice behind him, you are staring at the sky again. Ryan turned to see Kayla'ryn approaching, her expression amused. I'm a pilot, he said. It's a professional habit. I was beginning to suspect you were counting clouds. I tried that once, Ryan said solemnly. I lost track at 43 and had to start over. It was very stressful. She laughed softly, then stepped beside him, resting her hands on the railing. For a moment they watched the ships together, the wind carrying faint currents of warm air from the city below. The outer observatory has confirmed, she said quietly. The micro-singularity passed beyond the system. The defense grid is fully stable again. Ryan nodded. Good. I'd hate to think the first planet I ever helped protect got swallowed by a cosmic wrinkle a week later. That would look terrible on my record. Kayla'ryn glanced at him. You speak as if you intend to leave soon. Ryan was silent for a moment. That question had been waiting, unspoken, for days. He had known it would come. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me feels like I should. A pilot isn't meant to stay in one place forever. And another part, she asked gently. Ryan looked out at the horizon, at the pale light spreading across the distant terraces and towers. Another part of me feels like leaving now would be unfinished. They stood in silence, and the wind moved softly through the open gallery, carrying the faint, distant hum of the city. Later that day, Ryan was summoned once more to the Queen Regent's private chamber. This time when he entered, he felt none of the tension that had accompanied his earlier visits. The room felt familiar, the light warm rather than intimidating. The queen regarded him with a calm, thoughtful expression. "You have been here long enough to know this world," she said, "and long enough, I think, to know yourself a little better." Ryan smiled faintly. "I hope so. It would be embarrassing to travel across half the galaxy and learn nothing." "You have learned something," she said. "You have learned to stay." Ryan considered that. She was right. Not staying forever, perhaps not, but staying long enough to understand, to care, to become part of something larger than his own solitary path. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that moving forward meant never stopping. That if I stayed too long in one place, I'd lose something. Momentum, maybe. But I think I was wrong. Sometimes you have to stop long enough to see where you actually are." The queen inclined her head slightly. "And where are you, Pilot Nash?" Ryan hesitated, then answered honestly. "Somewhere I didn't expect to belong, but do." That evening, the palace held a small gathering on one of the upper terraces. Not a ceremony, not an announcement, simply a quiet celebration of the restored defense network and the passing of the recent danger. Music drifted through the air, played on instruments whose tones shimmered like distant stars. Lanterns floated slowly above the terrace, casting soft light across the gathered guests. Ryan found himself standing beside Kayla'ryn near the edge of the terrace, watching the lanterns rise. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For not running away," she said simply. Ryan chuckled. "I considered it, but I wasn't sure I could outrun the palace kitchens. They seem very determined." She smiled, then grew quiet. "When I first spoke in the receiving chamber," she said, "I believed the bond was something inevitable, something that would simply happen. Now I understand that it is something we must choose, again and again." Ryan looked at her, at the calm certainty in her expression, and realized how much she had changed. Not losing her sincerity, but gaining patience, understanding, and the courage to let the future unfold at its own pace. "I'm glad you said those words," he said softly. She blinked in surprise. "You are?" "Yes," he said, "because they brought me here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music drifted, the lanterns rose, and the sky of Thesara deepened into a vast field of quiet stars. Ryan realized then that the confusion he had felt on the day he arrived was gone. In its place was something steadier, not certainty, not even a clear plan, but a sense of direction shaped not by obligation, but by choice. He was still a pilot. He would still travel, still see new worlds and distant suns. But now he understood that belonging did not have to mean staying forever. It could mean carrying a place and the people in it wherever you went. As the last lantern drifted upward and vanished into the night, Ryan felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. Whatever paths lay ahead, they would not be walked alone.